Formula 3 returned to action this weekend in the hills of Styria as the cars ventured around the mountains to the sound of wonderful, wonderful engine noise. And we had some thrilling racing going on up and down the field, and we also had a lot of controversy throughout. I'm Craig Willard, and I'm here to discuss all things FIA Formula 3 at Red Bull Ring, W Series at Red Bull Ring, and Road to Indy at a number of circuits as we bring up to date on that, along with Bethany Waring and Alejandro Alonso Lopez. So I think we're going to head straight into FIA Formula 3, and we had three absolutely scintillating races this weekend. And really, the man of the weekend was Dennis Hauger of Prema Racing, who pulled off a pretty remarkable feat by taking pole position in race one after Alpine junior Caio Collet was denied due to track limits at the dying moments of the session. Well, after the session had ended, really, before the qualifying report had been filed, he had lost his pole position. And Ollie Caldwell also featured towards the top in the second Prema. And in that first race, he kept behind Hauger throughout. Well, Hauger leapfrogged him and was able to come from a remarkable 12th place on the grid to take victory ahead of Caldwell, whilst Logan Sargent was set to take his first Shuri's Racing System podium after a collision between Clement Novalak and Matteo Nannini, only to be one of 11 drivers to receive a penalty or a disqualification in that particular race. Sargent ended up dropping well down the order, and that meant that Jack Doohan took a podium finish, whilst Enzo Fittipaldi was fourth place, which I'm sure that Bethany will be absolutely thrilled with. We'll cover off the other two races as well quickly. The raft of penalties meant that we were going to have, I think it was possibly Johnny Edgar on pole for race two. And then when Ayumu Iwasa was excluded from the race, I put Frederick Vesti on pole. And then when the raft of penalties came through just minutes before race two started, David Schumacher was on pole, and he converted brilliantly to his first Formula 3 win and his first podium as well. Frederick Vesti, who was painfully close to snatching pole position from Hauger, climbed up the order to take second place ahead of Hauger himself, who climbed up another 10 spots in addition to the 11 spots he climbed in the first race, to take third. Arthur de Klerk had a DRS failure in the first race and climbed all the way up the order to P6, which is quite spectacular, whilst Roman Stanek picked up his best Formula 3 finish with fourth. One interesting moment in that race was Calum Frederick having a collision with Juan Manuel Correa, which broke a, I think it was a wrist.
He had a dislocated, fractured thumb. Was that Frederick?
I think that was it. Yes, thank you. He had a collision with Juan Manuel Correa and had to pull out. So into the third race, we had Frederick Vesti brilliantly beating Hauger to the win there, with an early overtake to take the lead. It was one of those pretty well symbolic of Formula 3, contemporary Formula 3 ART versus Prema thrillers, with Ollie Caldwell and Alexander Smolia not far behind. Hauger felt that he could have won the race if not for a late virtual safety car for a collision between the two Jacks, Doohan and Crawford. And there was a massive accident involving Victor Martin and Arden de Klerk, in which Clement Novalak was collected. The Klerk was taken to hospital, but with no major injuries, whilst Novalak limped away from the collision. So, guys, I think the first point of topic has to be Dennis Hauger, who had a very interesting weekend, a very successful weekend, a little bit stressful as well, as he was under investigation for an illegal plank, a plank that had been declared for his teammate's car, but was later applied to his car. And so Bethany, I'm going to come to you first. 3 podiums from a single weekend, obviously the most that a driver has ever taken in this championship in its current guise because of the increased number of races, obviously. So how impressed were you with Dennis's weekend?
Yeah, he's really good, and I think it's a testament of the way this format is that you can't. But obviously, you can sit at the front and then run away with it, like we saw Schumacher do in race 2. But you're not going to win the championship by doing that, because you can only do that one race a weekend. The other races, you're going to be, if you win, you start at the front in one race, and you're going to be starting at least another race in P12, and you've got to know how to climb up through the field, and Hauger did that incredibly well.
Yeah, certainly. And just to clarify on the plank issue, he was fined €7,500, which is pretty much peanuts to him and a team like Prema. But he
Which
kept
is it's a very good penalty for administration things. You wouldn't want to see, for example, a race winner get disqualified for an administration error. What FIA championship would ever do something like that?
That sounds very electrifying, that one. Anyway, Alejandro, coming to you. What did you make of Hauger's weekend? You were able to obviously dip in and out of watching Formula 3 whilst you were traveling this weekend. We were chatting before recording. But it was certainly a very, very strong total weekend from the young Norwegian.
Yes, definitely. Tennis has made a huge step forward since last year, and he's proving his talent. Definitely, we are seeing the Dennis that we saw in the past in Formula 4 championships. And yeah, as my colleague commented previously, we saw him coming through the field, which is something very, very important to do in this new format, because we've seen in the previous events that Frederick Besti has struggled a lot when he had to start from the back. I mean, top 10, not at the front. So yeah, he's been determined, and he was really on it this weekend.
Yeah, certainly. I totally agree, and I was very, very impressed generally with Hauger's sort of just approach the weekend and the way how he handled himself during the many press conferences he had to sit in. The poor guy, obviously had to sit in every single one because he qualified in the top 3 and finished each race in the top 3. So I'm pretty sure he's sick of seeing my face now. But yeah, it was just very sort of calm, very relaxed. And was very, very, just very strong this weekend. It was very ominous in a lot of ways, to the point where you sort of draw comparisons to the previous couple of years with how strong Prema have been, and it doesn't necessarily tend, we're not quite seeing it from Caldwell and Leclerc in the same way. So I'm kind of thinking that perhaps Prema's advantage isn't quite as strong as some people were making it out to be, or how it was in previous couple of years. So I do think that a lot of it is just down to Hauger being absolutely brilliant, absolutely methodical, and just completely clinical when it comes to pulling off overtakes, with the exception of Barcelona race 2. But that's his one mistake so far this season. That's his one off race so far out of 9, and the rest of the time has been absolutely brilliant. I do think we should talk about Fred Vesti as well, the young Mercedes junior. I thought he had generally a really strong weekend overall, and I thought the way how he executed the third race, the main race, was stunning. To beat Hauger on a weekend where Hauger looked unbeatable, I thought was certainly worthy of applause as well. So, Alejandro, I'll come to you first. I don't know whether you caught the third race or not, but how did you rate Vesti's weekend? And is he very much now the big challenger to Hauger at this point of the season, do you think?
Yes, definitely. He was actually my favorite coming into the season, and then after round 1 and round 2, which were a bit complicated, let's say, for him, he just had a good weekend, a solid weekend with 2 podiums, one of them a win. So I think he's now sitting second in the standings, like 40 points behind Hoger, but I think he can challenge him if he goes forward with that trend going up. I think he will pretty much challenge Hauger till the end of the season.
Yeah, and obviously Vesti's got a lot of experience with winning in FIA Formula 3. Took 3 wins last year, and this weekend he took his 4th win in the championship. Bethany, do you see Vesti as being Hauger's best challenger at this point of the season, or do you think that the championship is still so close in a lot of places that other drivers will be able to come back into the mix?
Yeah, I don't think we can really rule out anybody else at the moment, but Vessi has been Helga's top challenger in recent, at least in the last round. That last race was brilliant from him. He didn't just have he didn't just have Helga he was challenging, but Smolja was right there as well. So it was a lot of pressure, and he handled it well with safety cars and drivers going off and making sure he didn't go over the lines and things like that. It went really well, but I do expect that we'll have other players coming into it later on. Caldwell has done well climbing up, like you said. He's not quite, hasn't quite had what Hauger's had, but will certainly be in the mix. I think Leclerc, if he could just stop making mistakes for 5 minutes, he's very good at coming up through the field, but not quite at staying there. So I think the other Prima drivers will almost definitely have a hand to play in this title fight if it does end up being between Vessi and Hauger. But how many? We've had such a big break in Formula 3. I'm not quite sure how many rounds we've had, but we've definitely got a lot more to come.
Yeah, we've had 3 rounds. We're approaching the halfway point of the season of the 7 rounds now. I do think that there are plenty of other championship contenders still in the mix. I wouldn't count out Smolja at all. He's certainly showed a lot of improvement, and he thinks that he needs, if he nails qualifying, he's going to be pretty much in the mix as well. I wouldn't count out Trident as well. They've obviously been very strong at this level, and I think that prior to this weekend, especially, Novalak was being brilliantly methodical in the same way how he took his British Formula 3 championship, and Doohan, I thought, was stunning at Paul Ricard, and obviously has lots of potential as well, but things kind of unraveled for those guys this weekend. One Trident driver who did not have things unravel for him was Schumacher, who took his first win. Yes, it came from a reverse grid, but Alejandro, the way how he controlled the race from the front was absolutely brilliant, wasn't it?
Yes, he didn't make a single mistake, so he just pulled away, broke the DRS distance, and went from life to flag to victory. I think probably it's not the first time we see such a performance in a driver that usually runs in the midfield. I think, my personal opinion, that it's not that difficult for those guys who get reverse grid pole or reverse with top starting position to stay there, as they stay in the train and don't start losing positions. They are actually able to perform great. So the level of the field is so close, and if you can manage to put it all together in a race like Schumacher did, of course, on Saturday afternoon, they all can do a great job, and that was Schumacher's case in race 2.
Yeah, certainly. We've seen a few instances this year of drivers from mid-grid teams, perhaps starting on reverse grid pole and not really converting it into a huge amount. But I think it's a little bit different with Schumacher's case being with Trident, a team that has been proven to be so strong. And Schumacher's shown a bit of speed at times this year, but it just isn't quite strung together for him. I do think we should probably talk about penalties because there were a lot of them. I think there were 25 applied post or during the races in total across the 3 races this weekend, which is absolutely nuts. We had 260 track violations, over 400 laps across the weekend deleted, and a whole bunch of weaving as well in qualifying that was investigated. Bethany, thoughts?
Sorry, I think the FIA needs to invest in some coloring books because clearly the drivers don't know how to stay between the lines. I'm not a racing driver. I feel like we've all established that fact, but it's like rule number one: your lap doesn't count if you don't stay between the lines. And I think 1 or 2 per driver, fair enough, especially in practice because you need to know where those limits are and everything. But after practice, when it counts, you need to know that your lap can count, and it's not going to count if you exceed track limits. And it did get a bit stupid this weekend, but they've had so many violations. Just drive in between the lines. It was so silly. And while we can say, oh wow, if everyone was doing it, we shouldn't get a penalty, then that's just a daft way of thinking. If you want a championship where you don't have to stay between the lines, then I feel like we need to make a new one because that's not what circuit racing is. And it was just, I can't explain it. These drivers, while they are still young, they've had loads of time in motorsport, then they should know that you can't do this and then not expect your lap to be deleted. And the real victims of all this are people who are trying to write race reports and trying to write session reports, and you find out your driver who started on pole has had their lap time deleted. We're the real victims in all of this.
Yeah, pretty much. It certainly was stressful in that regard, and certainly on Saturday night it was very stressful as we waited for the final classification to come in. It didn't come through until gone midnight local time, which was quite incredible, really, as we waited for the outcome of Hauger's investigation in particular, to name at least one instance. But yeah, the track limits thing, what really got me was that, yes, there were a load of violations in qualifying. Okay, fair enough. The drivers obviously would have been able to see that. They did see that because there are a lot less in qualifying itself. And the session length was the same as practice. So obviously they took a bit more care in qualifying. But in the races, they just kept doing it. And it wasn't just the first race, it was the second race and then the third race as well. It was just a consistent bombardment of track abuse. And there are some drivers who were given 5-second penalties. There were some who were given 10-second penalties. There were some who were given 30-second penalties in lieu of a drive-through or a 10-second stop and go. And none of them have got anything to complain about because they just kept consistently doing it. And they were shown the black and white flag and they just completely ignored it. And it's something that Vesti brought up in the press conference on Saturday, I think it was, in the all the drivers who didn't get penalties were very happy that the drivers who did get penalties because of their constant abuse of track limits. and that's coming from Vesti, who had one of his qualifying times deleted himself. So I think he's got a very valid point there. However, that's not the thing that I'm most annoyed about in terms of investigating this weekend. The thing that really got me was the weaving during qualifying, which I think is highly dangerous. We've seen farcical qualifyings in Formula 3 in recent years at Monza. We didn't quite escalate to that this weekend. But I thought that was incredibly dangerous. You can't have drivers weaving on the straight when they're bunched up like that, when you've got some drivers possibly trying to start their final lap and so forth. I've hopefully got a column coming out on this soon. But the thing that really gets me is that one of these days it is going to result in a very nasty and totally unnecessary accident, and the FIA needs to clamp down on these things, especially when they specifically tell the drivers don't do it, which is exactly the same case in Formula One this weekend with the penalties that weren't handed out to the drivers who were bunched up at the in between turns 9 and 10. Yeah, 3 drivers were told exactly the same, and they all did it, and none of them got a penalty for it, which was frankly ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. There are, like I said, a number of other penalties. Iwasa was disqualified for having a floppy camera, which was probably the most bizarre penalty of the lot, I think, this weekend. And we had penalties awarded for various collisions as well. The one that I do want to bring up is the one between Leclerc and Martins. Leclerc was given a 3-place grid penalty for that. Alejandro, can I get your view on that? Because I've got my view on it. The stewards obviously decided it was Leclerc's fault. So do you agree with that, or do you see it from a different way?
To be honest, I'm still watching the incident and trying to find out who was at fault, because probably the space was too narrow to put the car there. But I don't know. Probably the track at that point is turning a little bit to the left, so Martin's just keeping his steering wheel straight was moving slightly to the right hand side of the circuit. So probably, I don't know, I would say it was a racing incident, mainly because those 2 factors. Probably there was not a real space there, and not a real gap to go for it, but also Martins took advantage of the track design to close the door without moving the steering wheel. So it's difficult to say for me. I don't know. I would say a racing incident, because I will also need to hear the drivers. What was their reasoning at that point to handle a penalty for one of them or not? Very difficult to judge from my side.
Yeah, Leclerc was obviously unavailable for comment as he was in hospital at the time. The stewards got Martin's view, of course, and they decided to give Leclerc the penalty. Bethany, how did you see that one play out?
It all just happened so fast. Like what 1 minute I was like writing notes, and then the next Leclerc was facing the wrong way around. It was kind of like when I play on simulator, but it was I probably kind of what Alejandro said. Really, like it seemed to be on the line between a racing incident and a penalty for Leclerc, and with the stewards having more information, they were probably right. But it was, you could see Leclerc afterwards was devastated, and I think, obviously I'm not inside his head, but it looked like he thought that was probably his fault. So I think it definitely wasn't the other driver who was in the gravel trap with him's fault. That one's for sure. But it just looked. It looked like he was devastated, but I think it was probably the right decision. And Leclerc had lots of practice of coming up through the field, so it probably won't be a huge issue for him at the next round when he has to take that.
The Hungaroring, which is traditionally not an easy circuit to overtake on, but I mean, we saw plenty of overtaking from Leclerc at Barcelona, which is another circuit where it's very difficult to overtake. But yeah, poor old Clement Novalak, his second crash in 3 days at turn 4, and in that one he was totally not at fault for sure. I had my first sort of proper time chatting with him on Thursday, and he seems like a very nice, well-rounded kid. It's brilliantly consistent as well when it comes to stringing a championship together, as we saw in his British F3 days, and we're seeing that. Well, we were seeing that this season as well up until this weekend. But yeah, I do. There are a lot of instances this weekend across the Formula 1 and the Formula 3 where I thought, was that really that person's fault? And did they certainly deserve a 5-second penalty and 2 penalty points for that? Let's not dwell on that as such. But yeah, I do think that Leclerc probably has to take the blame for that one, because Martin's, it wasn't so much of a chop, it was more of a fade, but kind of not, because of the way that the track is designed, as how Alejandro pointed out. And the gap just closed, and Leclerc had to back out, and he decided to not back out, and just totally ruined all of their races. But yeah, go ahead, Alejandro.
Yes, about that happening, probably I do even think that if it wasn't for Leclerc taking out Novalak, I think they would have deemed it as a race incident. I think that was pretty much the thing for the penalty, because they collected Novalak. Otherwise, I think, as we have also seen that in the past, that they take into account the consequences and not really the actions, which is what I think that should be penalized. But yeah, that's something also to take into account, that there was another driver in front that was actually already making the corner and was taken out of contention.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and not really something that I've really thought of before. And yeah, that is perhaps why it was a 3-place grid penalty, whereas sort of you take that incident in isolation, then you could very much make an argument for it certainly being a racing incident. But yeah, I think that that rounds up this Formula 3 weekend quite nicely. Helga's got a nice healthy lead in the championship now, but as we say, it's a long way to go. And Vesti in particular was bigging up ART's chances going forward. And ART, if I remember rightly, were absolutely brilliant at the Hungaroring last year. So this championship is far from done yet. Let's move on to W Series, which returned with a double header at Austria, and well, on the F1 bill, its first time on the F1 bill, and it was certainly interesting to see how those weekends played out. I think with W Series and how they operate, and obviously have the cars that are on rotation. I think the driver said that it's more the rears of the cars this year that are on rotation rather than the whole cars. I think we're seeing a bigger discrepancy between the cars this year, and that's perhaps being reflected in the results, which is possibly why we had 2 wildly different pecking orders from week 1 to week 2, despite being on the same circuit. Alice Powell, former GP3 runner, she absolutely crushed the opposition in the first weekend, taking the first total Grand Slam of topping practice, qualifying the race, leading every lap, getting fastest lap, all of that sort of good stuff. Leading home Sarah Moore, the first LGBTQ plus person to stand on a Formula One stand on a podium during a Formula One weekend, and Fabian Volvend. Whilst Jamie Chadwick had issues in qualifying and then was hit by Jess Hawkins early on in the race and recovered from a late safety car to finish in 6th. The second race, and Chadwick was back on the scintillating form that we became accustomed to in 2019. While Irina Sidorkova took her first podium at the age of 18, ahead of Emma Kymäläinen, the oldest driver in the field, with those two sharing a mother and daughter bond. Bikes last year's 2019's championship contender, stalled meanwhile and sits on no points after being hit by Kymäläinen in the first race. So I'm going to come to Bethany first. Just your general thoughts on W Series return. We've obviously had a feature go out last week about my thoughts on it, but it'd be good to get someone else's view.
Yeah, but it's good. I like W Series. I didn't watch it as closely as Formula 3. I didn't watch it at all in its first season, so I can't really compare it to that. Nothing against W Series. I was just very busy that year, but it looks good. It looks competitive. There are a lot of drivers who I personally had never heard of or hadn't heard of for a while that are racing in their championship. A lot of Ginetta Junior graduates, which is always very important. And it was some good racing that weekend. I only caught half of the first race because there was a lot of motorsport on the last weekend. But the both of the races, from what I saw, it didn't look boring, which I think is the main thing that I look for in junior series these days. It was good racing, and there were incidents, but I don't think it wasn't Formula 3 levels of stupid incidents, which is also very good.
Yeah, certainly. And you bring up the racing. Yeah, they have some good racing. They do it in the Formula Regional car as well, which we've traditionally slammed on this podcast before for not having good racing. And we do kind of continue to slam it for not really having good racing. But Alejandro, I want to get your thoughts on W Series as well. In particular, sort of the racing itself and the new color schemes we've got this year on top of that.
Well, if I give my honest thoughts about W Series, I would probably be banned from W Series paddock, but that's something else. That's something that has to do with, I mean, probably my general view of motorsport. But yeah, as you pointed out first, the thing that they rotate the cars, that's not for me, definitely, because we cannot see what's the real potential of the drivers. I mean, I cannot believe that round 1 Alice Powell was dominating and just could come 8th in the second round, and the same for Jamie Chadwick, which pretty much dominated the first season and started the championship in 6th, struggling with the car and also not so high in qualifying, and now dominated round 2. I don't know. That kind of things make me have a pretty bad opinion of the championship. It's the organization that I don't like. I of course think it's the best to have drivers fully funded from the organization, but apart from that, the rest, also the fact that they don't really have teams. Okay, now they are introducing teams somehow, but this year they are still operating under the same the people who prepare the cars are the same. So we will see how it develops in the future. But yeah, I think of course splitting the grid into teams is the right thing to do if they are going forward as a championship. But yeah, still lots of question marks, in my opinion, to be answered.
Yeah, I did get a chance to ask some of the drivers, well, the top three specifically, why the pecking order changed so drastically, and it did seem to be a case of we're not really sure, and possibly something to do with the cars being changed around, which is why I do think that might be behind there might be a huge discrepancy between the individual cars this year, which would be not good, I don't think. Something else I don't think would be good for the championship this year would be a year of Jamie Chadwick domination. Obviously, I think Jamie's a totally fine racing driver, but after her dismal year in regional last year, I don't think it will look too good on the championship if she comes along and walks away with it, or if she walks away with it more so than she did in the first year. What we really need to see this year is for the younger drivers and for some of the drivers who were out for a few years to come back really strong. And after the first race, I thought that we were getting there. I thought, oh yeah, this is brilliant. You got the likes of Alice Powell and Sarah Moore, who, they're established junior champions in their own right, and they're really starting to show it's like what they're able to do after a year of being back properly in the swing of things. And you had the likes of Belen Garcia, who I thought was brilliant in the first weekend, really really impressing as well, and Sidakova, who showed absolutely no fear to anyone, which I thought was fantastic. But the second weekend, when I saw Chadwick just have that extra edge on the rest of the field, that certainly doesn't bode too well going forward, because if Chadwick dominates this year, then that will put a huge question mark over the overall quality of the field, on the basis of her very difficult Formula Regional Championship last year. Yeah, go ahead.
Like you said, though, if Chadwick is doing very well at least in these early stages, while it's not a fantastic, she did race the car last year, which most of the field didn't do. I don't think any of the field did. So you can kind of, I'd say I wouldn't write off the rest of the field just yet, because obviously they might be still getting used to that car, especially the newcomers, compared to Chadwick, who's been racing in it two years now. Even if Formula Regional did not go well at all for anybody involved, to be honest, Formula Regional was just not great. But I'm hopeful at least that we'll see some other drivers up there and challenging at the very least once things have settled down a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very, very valid point. Yeah, a couple of drivers have done sort of a little bit of driving around in this car here and there, a couple of test days, and Belen Garcia has obviously been racing in Freck this year as well, albeit with very little preparation. So some of the drivers have got a little bit of experience coming into the season in this particular car, and other drivers have obviously been racing around in all sorts of other weird and wacky things, including Chadwick herself in Extreme E of all places, and some of them have done sports cars and so forth. So yeah, I do get the point, but I still think it, especially to those who just look at the results and don't necessarily look at the context, it's not going to look too good on the championship if Chadwick walks away with it this year, going forward. But yeah, we'll see how things pan out. I think it's a little bit too early to tell, and I think Silverstone's probably going to give a good indicator as to where things are, and whether we are talking of a big discrepancy between the cars, which given how close the field actually is in terms of sort of like the actual pace, would actually look quite good on the field as a whole, with how tight it was, especially in the first race. I haven't looked through the data for the second round, but I think it was a very similar sort of gap, especially in qualifying. So it's obviously a very tight field in that regard, but it does seem like they need to get the cars sort of more equal, which essentially is what they were trying to do in the first place, but they don't seem to have achieved it very well. Perhaps it probably would be more equal if they did have like the highest, the high quality teams that we've got in plenty of other junior single seater championships and so forth. I do think that the gaps between the likes of Prema and ART and so forth in these various championships. I can't think of any other like properly outstanding FREC team, but the gap between those are a tenth or two rather than 6 or 7 tenths. So we'll see how things pan out, I think, in that regard. I think we should move on to the road to Indy. Bethany, obviously this is not particularly your forte, but Alejandro, you got yourself very much deep in the mix with that this weekend. You had your first proper go at covering race reports for Formula Scout. So you took on USF 2000 this weekend, a very difficult championship to do reports for. So just generally, how did you find it? Your first time writing these things in anger?
I think I managed it okay. I mean, races, especially race 1 and race 2 of the USF 2000 weren't that complicated. They were quite sort of calm races, just with a few overtakes here and there, but no massive changes in the order. So it was good. I enjoyed the experience, learned a lot also, but especially from race 1 to race 3, I was able to make a big step forward in terms of organizing how to take notes down and all that kind of stuff, writing it all quickly. Yeah. I would give me a pass in the in the job if I'm allowed to, because I managed to complete the work, so that was already a win for me.
Yeah, certainly. And I do think like the likes of the Road to India are brilliant places to learn how to do race reports, because especially with USF 2000, because there are a lot of cars in that field. I believe that was their biggest field in many years this weekend at Mid-Ohio. And yeah, I can see why the reports might have been a little bit straightforward this weekend in comparison to Road America a couple of weekends ago, which I took it upon myself to take control of. So that was a bit more hectic. But Mid-Ohio is a much twistier course. So so who really stood out for you during that weekend? So your first time really looking in on this championship. I want to see whether your thoughts sort of align with what I've sort of noted down as to my standout stars of the season so far.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I lost you at the point.
Who really stood out for you this weekend? I want to see whether your thoughts are similar to the ones that I've had from watching most of the season so far.
I don't know. I would need to watch more. I mean, as we said already, it was all pretty much based on what we have in qualifying. So I don't really know. I mean, it seems from the outside that top 2 in the championship are so strong, but I don't know. I expected more probably from those in 3rd and 4th in the standings, and also 5th, who were pretty much nowhere this weekend. So we'll see. I'll keep watching it, because it was actually the very first time I watched a USF 2000 race. So I was really trying to get up to speed so quickly with drivers, who was driving each car. It was really complicated actually to spot what was happening to me. So yeah. probably I can give you a more detailed answer after the next round.
Yeah, certainly. Like I said, it's very, very difficult to keep tabs of who's driving for which team and so forth, and so many driver changes as well, and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, generally sort of across the season, Kiko Porto and Michael D'Orlando, they've really sort of picked up momentum in that championship going forward. Some of the drivers from earlier in the year, Juven Sindira, Josh Pearson and Christian Brooks, they're all sort of in touch, but they're lacking the consistency from the recent rounds to really kick their title push going forward into the final few rounds. So the title back between those two, Porto and D'Orlando, is going to be brilliant. We'll probably end up interviewing at least one of them at some point post-season, as well as we have done in recent years. Let's talk about Indy Pro 2000 as well, which was also in action at Mid-Ohio this weekend, and that's starting to go the way of the reigning USF 2000 champion, Christian Rasmussen, who has taken 6 wins out of the last 9 races. He's really picking up some strong form this year, but he's not totally running away with it, because Braden Ease is very much in contention, but he's lacking the podium finishes from recent races. Reece Gold, Artem Petrov and Hunter McElroy are all sort of thereabouts, but they've only had 3 race wins between them this season as well. We should talk about Indy Lights as well, which is back this year after its 2020 hiatus, and at the moment that's going the way of Kyle Kirkwood, the most successful driver ever on the road to Indy at this point, with a huge number of wins, overtaking Spencer Pickett's long-standing record in many fewer races, and in doing so, Kirkwood is doing exactly what he did in USF 2000 and in Indy Pro 2000, in just absolutely getting wins under his belt. As soon as he starts to hit a run, he just looks unstoppable, and at this point it does seem like he's on the way to take another championship. It would be his 5th in 3 years if you discount 2020 due to COVID. But David Malukas is very much keeping in touch. The HMD Motorsports driver is very much in the mix. That team looks very, very strong this year. While the Global Racing Group with HMD banner run Linus Lundqvist, his momentum stalled, and he had a miserable weekend at Mid-Ohio with I think it was 3 crashes in the space of only a few hours on qualifying day, which has very much stalled any momentum that he had going. So that's sort of bring you up to date on the road to Indy. Like I said, we'll have probably the champion, hopefully the champions come on for chats, as was the case last year. There's some brilliant chats with Rasmussen and Stingray Rob, the champions from that year, and we've had the previous champions on, and the road to Indy I think is brilliant in getting drivers all the way to IndyCar. So that's generally bringing you all up to speed with things that have been going on around the junior single-seater racing world at the moment. But going forward, we've got plenty coming up in recent weeks, and in the coming weeks we've got F2 and W Series at Silverstone, not this weekend but next weekend, and this weekend we've got Euro Formula Open in action. We've got plenty of Formula 4 championships in action. We've got Formula Ford in action as well, Anglesey I believe it is. I'm off to Donington to watch British Formula 3, which will be good fun. I do need to pack my umbrella though, by the sounds of it. And we've got plenty of other things going on, plenty of features up and down the website. I've got my 5 things from the Red Bull Ring for you all to read, and hopefully got another feature coming out where I ramble on about penalties and weaving and boring stuff like that. But yes, we've got plenty of news stories as well. We're very much on the ball with the penalties, and I've got all the reaction from the drivers from the weekend on top of that. So that, I think, draws this week's podcast to a close, and I should probably get another cup of tea once we've finished, as my mouth is starting to get very dry. So we will call it there. I guess we'll be back soon with another Formula Scout podcast.